Something is being done to the American middle class that has no single author, no press conference, no official announcement, and no moment you can point to and say, that is when it started. It is happening in the price of eggs at the grocery store. It is happening in the insurance premium that went up 30% this year for no apparent reason. It is happening in the mortgage rate that turned the house your parents bought on one income into something that requires two incomes, a perfect credit score, and a down payment that takes a decade to save. It is happening in the retirement account that is technically growing but somehow never feels like enough. It is happening everywhere simultaneously, in amounts small enough that each individual increase seems explainable, justifiable, temporary. But that together, compounded over 10 and 20 years, are systematically dismantling the financial foundation of the largest and most important economic class in American history. And the most dangerous part is not the destruction itself. The most dangerous part is that the people experiencing it are being told repeatedly and convincingly that it is their fault, that they are not working hard enough, that they are spending too much on avocado toast, that they need to cut their streaming subscriptions and make their own coffee, that the solution to a structural economic transformation that has been decades in the making is a personal, behavioral adjustment that is entirely within their control. That narrative, the narrative that middle-class financial struggle is primarily a personal failure rather than a systemic outcome, is the most expensive lie that tens of millions of Americans have ever been sold. And the people selling it are the same people who benefit most from the middle class, not understanding what is actually happening to them. Today, I am going to show you exactly what is actually happening. Not at the surface level of rising prices and stagnant wages that you already know about. At the deeper level of the specific mechanisms, the structural forces that have been quietly and methodically eroding middle-class financial security for decades and that are continuing right now, while most people are focused on symptoms rather than causes. The first mechanism is the one doing more damage to more middle-class families than any other single force, and that is almost never discussed with the honesty and specificity it deserves. It is not inflation in the abstract. It is the specific structural divergence between the prices of the things the middle class needs to buy and the wages the middle class earns for its work. The official inflation number, the Consumer Price Index, is a blended average of price changes across a broad basket of goods and services, and as a blended average, it obscures something critically important about the middle class experience. Not all prices have risen at the same rate. The prices that have risen fastest and most severely are concentrated in exactly the categories that constitute the largest share of middle-class spending: housing, healthcare, higher education, and childcare. And the prices that have risen slowest, or even fallen, are concentrated in categories that represent a smaller share of middle-class spending, like electronics, clothing, and certain food commodities. The result is a consumer price index that looks manageable in the headlines, but that dramatically understates the real inflation experienced by the middle-class family, whose two largest expenses are a mortgage and health insurance. When housing costs have risen 40 to 50% in many markets over the past 5 years, and health insurance premiums have risen at 3 to 4 times the rate of general inflation for 2 decades, and the cost of putting a child through a 4-year university has increased by more than 1,200% since 1980, the blended average that becomes the official inflation number is not describing the financial reality of the people living inside those specific cost pressures. And here is the part that transforms this from an economic observation into a mechanism of wealth transfer. The costs that have risen fastest, housing, healthcare, education, are the costs of entry into the middle class itself. They are the costs of living in a safe neighborhood, of staying healthy without financial ruin, of acquiring the credentials that access middle-class employment. When those costs rise faster than middle-class wages, which they have consistently for decades, the middle class does not just become more financially stressed, it becomes structurally less accessible. The floor of what it costs to be middle class keeps rising. The wages available for middle class work rise more slowly, and the gap between them is filled by debt, mortgage debt, student loan debt, medical debt, credit card debt that transfers wealth from middle-class families to the financial institutions holding that debt for decades. The second mechanism is the one that has systematically hollowed out the economic security that middle-class employment once provided, and it is the destruction of what economists call the employment relationship. The shift from stable long-term employment with benefits, pensions, and career ladders to the gig economy model of contract work, temporary positions, and the permanent uncertainty of employment that can be terminated without notice, without severance, and without the benefits that once made middle-class work a genuine pathway to long-term security. This shift did not happen by accident. It happened because it was enormously profitable for the companies driving it. When a company converts a full-time employee with salary, benefits, and pension obligations into a contractor or gig worker, it eliminates not just the salary but the employer's contribution to Social Security and Medicare, the health insurance premium, the retirement plan contribution, the workers' compensation insurance, and the unemployment insurance liability. The total cost reduction can be 30 to 40% of the full-time employee's total compensation. Package a reduction that flows directly to corporate profits and through stock buybacks and dividends to shareholders. The middle-class worker on the other side of this shift experiences it as a loss of security that is almost impossible to fully quantify in the moment it happens. The income might be similar or even higher in the short term, but the loss of employer-provided health insurance, the loss of retirement plan contributions, the loss of paid leave, the loss of the predictability that made it possible to plan a financial life. These losses are not visible in a monthly paycheck the way a salary cut would be. They show up years later in retirement savings that were never accumulated, in medical bills that insurance would have covered, in financial fragility, during economic disruptions that stable employment would have buffered. The third mechanism is the one that operates most invisibly and has the longest compounding effect on middle-class wealth, and it is the systematic financialization of the American economy in ways that benefit asset owners at the direct expense of wage earners. The American housing market was once primarily a market for shelter, a place where families bought homes to live in, built equity over time, and eventually owned an asset free and clear that provided security in retirement. It has been progressively transformed into a financial asset class, something that institutional investors, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, and wealthy individual investors buy as an investment, optimizing for financial returns rather than housing humans. The consequences of this transformation for middle-class families are direct and devastating. When housing is primarily a shelter market, prices are anchored to local wage levels because the buyers are local wage earners. When housing becomes a financial asset class, prices are anchored to the returns available to institutional capital, which are completely disconnected from local wage levels. Institutional investors buying single-family homes do not care whether the local median income can support the purchase price. They care whether the rental yield and appreciation potential justify the investment. This is why housing has become simultaneously unaffordable for middle-class purchase and generating extraordinary returns for institutional investors. Not as a contradiction, but as two sides of the same mechanism. The unaffordability for buyers is the source of the returns for investors. The families who cannot buy become the renters who generate the cash flow that justifies the institutional investment. And the wealth those families would have built through home equity over 30 years of ownership instead flows as rental income and asset appreciation to the institutional investors who own the homes they live in. The fourth mechanism is the lifestyle inflation trap, and the specific way that the consumer culture built around the middle class has been engineered to ensure that rising income is continuously converted into rising consumption rather than rising wealth. This is not a conspiracy in the sense of a coordinated plan. It is an emergent property of an economy where hundreds of billions of dollars per year are spent on advertising, product development, and distribution specifically designed to convert every dollar of middle-class income growth into consumption spending as quickly as possible before it can be redirected into savings or investment. The mechanism works through something called the hedonic treadmill. The psychological tendency for humans to adapt quickly to improved circumstances and return to a baseline level of satisfaction that demands continuous upgrading to maintain. When your income goes up, your reference point for what constitutes an acceptable lifestyle adjusts upward with it. The apartment that was fine 3 years ago feels inadequate now. The car that felt new 2 years ago feels dated. And the income that could have been redirected into wealth building instead funds the continuous upgrade cycle that keeps consumption growing in lockstep with income. The result at a population scale is the phenomenon that has become the defining financial characteristic of the American middle class: the ability to project the appearance of prosperity while accumulating almost no actual wealth. Two-income households earning $150,000 per year with no meaningful savings, significant debt, and a retirement account growing too slowly to generate adequate retirement income. The income is real. The lifestyle is real. The wealth is largely illusory, dependent on the continuous flow of employment income with almost no buffer between current prosperity and financial crisis. The silent destruction of the American middle class is not silent because it is hidden. It is silent because it has been successfully framed as something other than what it is, as personal failure rather than structural outcome, as temporary difficulty rather than long-term trajectory. You'll now see it for what it is: the structural price divergence that makes the middle class progressively less affordable to inhabit. The destruction of the employment relationship that eliminated the security and benefits that once made middle class work a genuine pathway to long-term stability. The financialization of housing that converted the primary middle-class wealth-building mechanism into an asset class that extracts rental income from the families who can no longer afford to own. The lifestyle inflation trap that ensures rising income is continuously converted into rising consumption rather than rising wealth. In the next video, I'm going to show you exactly what to do about each of these forces, the specific decisions and structural changes that separate the people the middle class destruction catches from the people it passes over. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss it. Drop a comment below. Which of these 4 mechanisms is closest to your own experience? I read every single one. See you in part 2.